the panelists to join me on stage. So we have, and I hope I get your name correct, BASIL, Demetrius, if you here, there you are. We also have Simon Harding Roots from the Crown Estate, and hopefully Jonny Wates from the Wates Group. Great. So we're going to be slightly less than the hour we had intended and get this discussion going in 46 minutes exactly and 17 seconds. So yeah, as it's been said, in this session we're really going to put a spotlight on the built environment, which is obviously a key contributor to carbon emissions, and it's a really important sector in that move towards sustainability. So my name is Audrey Nugent, and I'm the Director of Global Advocacy at the World Green Building Council. So we are the world's largest global, regional, local action network, driving that systemic change in our sector. So it was really interesting just to hear a little bit of the last session, because we talk a lot about, the floor space growth in Africa and the challenges that brings, and just the challenges inherent in the built environment at the global stage are quite huge. It's responsible for 37% of global emissions and 40% of raw materials extraction. It also stewards the largest global asset class, representing 13% of global GDP and generating nearly 9% of employment globally. And the International Labour Organization has predicted that in the transition to the green economy, we're going to see a net increase in construction jobs. And that's despite the fact that we will be losing those so-called brown jobs or more polluting jobs. And there's a lot of political momentum at the moment behind taking action in the building sector. We saw the outcome of the COP28 climate agreement, really mandating a role for buildings in terms of a drive towards increased energy efficiencies, renewable capacities. And also this year, we've seen the launch of the declaration, the SHIO, which the UK has signed up to, and the Buildings Breakthrough, which the UK has always signed up to. But, the importance and the delivery of those commitments can only be done if we have the right skills, we have the right capacities in place. And I really just want to maybe introduce the panel and hear from them about what they think are the key challenges in actually getting us there, specifically in the UK context. So I'm just going to ask everyone to kind of do a quick intro themselves. So maybe we can go in what I think would be alphabetical order. So BASIL, Simon, and then Jonny, just to introduce yourself to the audience, what your role is, and your perspectives on how the topic of sustainability in the construction sector is driving innovation and what that is doing in terms of jobs creation and the impact that may have.
Easy question. I'll try to be succinct. So BASIL, DEMEROUTIS, nice to be here. Thanks for persevering over a long morning already. So we're an investor developer. So we're a customer, effectively, of a lot of the green transition activity and green products and innovations that we're going to talk about today. And we've been doing it for about 12, 13 years as an investor developer, and our sole purpose is really to drive down carbon and drive up social impact in the built environment. We think that there's greater financial returns to be made by doing that. We've done about 1.5 million square feet of real estate here in the UK. I think, although I share on the unbridled enthusiasm of Lord Turner and of James just before us, I think just maybe zeroing in on some of the context and scene setting that you did a moment ago as well. I think I'd say 3 things. First of all, the problem in the built environment is tremendously large. 40% of the carbon emissions, 36% of global energy, as you mentioned. As a society, we mine about 100 billion tons of materials from the earth every year. 40 to 50% of that goes to the built environment. That's something like 30 to 40 kilograms for every person on the planet every single day that we harvest and steal from Mother Nature. The problem that we're facing and the challenge is immense. It's also incredibly complicated. As an investor developer, if you just look around the room around you, the number of industries represented in the materials, whether it's the carpet industry or timber or steel, glass, there are probably, 40, 50 different industries represented in just the 10 square meters just where you might be sitting. And we know from the buildings that we do, where we actually track and measure when we're doing a refurbishment, literally every nut, bolt, and screw that comes into the building For example, down at Tower Bridge, where we're on site with a building called TBC London, there's something like 2 million individual items that we've brought into the building so far in that retrofit. 4,500 different SKUs, different individual products and services. So incredibly complicated. And I'd say thirdly and finally that if we look at the history of our industry and the built environment as a predictor of the future, I don't think you'd be particularly optimistic. And perhaps breaking with conduit tradition, I'll be a bit of a pessimist. We build buildings the same way that we've built them for the last 100 years. If you were to look at how we built the skyscrapers in the 1920s and 30s, they're pretty much exactly how we build them today. And indeed, if you look at, say, something like the buildings in New York City, the Empire State Building is about 430 meters tall. The Shard is 310 meters tall. And those buildings are separated by about 80 years, celebrated as the tallest building in Europe. We talk about this being the fourth industrial revolution. I think the property industry has slept through the first three, so hopefully this one will be a bit different. Last innovations in the built environment, hard to think of really any much after air conditioning, which is the 1940s, lifts, 1860s, and so on. So I think we're at the cusp of something potentially great and amazing, but it's going to take a real systemic and system change mindset in order to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it's nice to be optimistic, but sometimes it's nice to just kind of set out the reality that we're facing and then actually think about how can we come together and collaborate to overcome that and deliver that systemic change. So maybe, Simon, I can come to you and kind of put the same question.
Sure. Yeah, are we connected on? Yes. Simon Harding-Roots, so I'm the Managing Director who's responsible for the London portfolio of the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate is a national, privately run business, but that returns all of our profit back to the government, to the Treasury. So we're quite a unique mix. We operate at scale. We have four main businesses. An odd mix you wouldn't necessarily bring together, but we happen to manage the seabed for 12 miles all around England, Northern Ireland, and Wales. A few years ago, there was a bit of a so what around that. Today, with the wonders of offshore energy, that's a huge issue for us and for the country, which we are very proud to be part of with the new Great British Energy Initiative that came very quickly from the Prime Minister. So suddenly things change, and that's the world we live in, which is very exciting. We have a rural portfolio and a regional portfolio, and my bit, very London-centric. Wonderfully refreshing. I'm a passionate Londoner, but wonderfully refreshing to hear a continental discussion about Africa at scale. That's really quite refreshing from my world, which is very London-centric, as much as I love it. So my role is managing 10 million square feet right in the heart of the West End, which some of you will know. So it's the Regent Street, St James's portfolio predominantly. 60% of it's commercial offices, but then obviously the high-profile retail and F&B that sits generally on the ground floor. A huge driver for London's economy. And recently that came out again with another very high-profile statement this week from the Deputy Prime Minister about a mayoral development corporation right in the heart of Oxford Street and taking part of Regent Street. So I think a recognition that London as a powerhouse is not something to be ashamed of. Levelling up is great, but you've got to tend to the engine room, and I'm delighted. We seem to be getting, again, another big shift and recognition around that. One of my key challenges, which hopefully we'll have time to talk about in particular, is the historic environment. So most of my 10 million square feet I manage and I'm redeveloping and refurbishing is in conservation area, is listed buildings, and it's really hard to get those wonderful, beautiful buildings fit for purpose for the 21st century. So there was a mention earlier about leaky homes. I've got 10 million square feet of very, very leaky offices and retail space out there. Crital windows, like you see here, all wonderful, all listed and protected. They leak like sieves. So how do we as an industry stop using that as an excuse or coming up against the heritage lobby who just say no because they don't know what the alternatives are, and work together to find solutions? We can't just keep scratching our head. We've got to get on and do stuff. So that's something we might be able to touch on in terms of solutions. But that's a brief overview of what I'm up to.
Great, thank you. And then lastly to Jonny, and that's definitely something we want to come back to, is the retrofitting challenge, which is obviously huge in the UK and Europe and North America. But Jonny, maybe if you want to just briefly introduce yourself and maybe perhaps touch on the point BASIL raised about, the systemic change we need in the built environment, if that's...
Okay, great, thank you. And great to be here. So I'm Jonny Wates. I'm a fourth generation owner and board director of Wates Group, which is a UK-based sort of broad built environment company. So we're a contractor for others in various sectors, across offices, gigafactories, schools, housing. But we're also a developer in our own right, particularly in residential, and we have a small commercial business as well. In the context of this conversation, maybe something of interest is a sort of philosophy of the purpose of the organization. The owners want to hand on a stronger enterprise to the fifth generation. They're already in the company. And that word stronger is super interesting today and is very provocative for us. We're really engaged strongly with what that might be. And actually the fifth generation themselves in their 20s are very challenging, as you would hope, around that question. So we have a sort of stewardship idea. We think a lot about legacy and we think a lot about the longer term. And our view in-house is that actually change is coming. We're in the midst of it. It feels very unstable and uncomfortable. It definitely doesn't feel like business as usual. And there's a lot of stress and tension in the industry. So whilst I agree with Basil that the record of the industry doesn't look great, it's inevitable, it's going to come. And it's coming in various forms. The origin of a lot of it is in social justice and in environmental challenges, which we know all about. So we see legislation changing, we see regulation changing, we see technology changing very quickly as well. And as deliverers, which is our contracting business, we see really significant challenges as we scale up and adapt, sort of mobilize around what our clients' changing requirements are. So the family view is that we're not going to hand on anything stronger if we're not more durable, if we're not more fit for purpose. So we're really grasping the nettle, if you like, around being purposeful and translating that into a vision of a portfolio of what that business activity might be down the road. And maybe, excuse me, maybe I could, one of the things that we do specifically to get a bit more granular is we maintain a lot of public housing. We're number 2, I think, in that market. It's about 500,000 homes a year we're maintaining, and we do new build as well around that. So there's a big story around retrofit of public housing that I can share with you a little bit later on if that suits.
Sounds good. Great. I mean, maybe just to stick on that point of retrofitting, because it's been mentioned by both of you, and obviously that's a huge challenge within the UK, and it's made even more challenging by the kind of cultural heritage aspects that we obviously need to protect. So maybe Simon, if I can come to you and just get you to share some of your perspectives on that, and also mindful in my discussions with our wider network of green building councils, a huge part of that challenge is also just upskilling the workforce and what kind of green skills do you need in the workforce to deliver that. So maybe you first, Simon. And
yeah, let me kick off with that. So I suppose 2 themes on that for us in particular. One is the heritage aspect and the protection afforded to heritage buildings. Quite rightly, no one's challenging that in principle, but the need to adapt and to bring in technology and technological innovation for new solutions. And I think the problem has been often when you have developers, it's a site by site, and so it's quite hard to scale it up. The big advantage we have as the principal London estate and partnering as we do with the other London estates is we can work at scale, we can invest in long-term innovation. And it's wonderfully simple, but I'm going to come back to the windows point because I think it highlights this, that we're setting up a pilot, we're leading in this as the Crown Estate to innovate appropriate solutions for double glazing replacements at scale. And I know, probably some of you would have done that domestically on your homes, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We have thousands of windows across our estate. It has to work. We can't, we've got to make this work properly. And then we want that to be a solution to share with others. So we're funding that up front. We're a long-term business. We've been around 300 years. We hope we'll be around another 300. So that's, I think, where we step up as large landowners. partner with others, bring them on the journey. And there are other examples around that where we can just choose something that's going to have impact, stop them leaking, reduce energy, get massive benefit. And then the other aspect is skills, absolutely. And again, we partnered with Grosvenor, with National Trust, with Peabody and Historic England to prepare a fact-based report on the skills shortage, which we all know in the industry, and all due respect to Wates, I wish I had you on tap for my domestic renovations, but how hard it is to get a good plumber, how hard it is to get a good electrician in your own home, let alone trying to manage big estates and do the right thing and preserve historic buildings. There are specific skill sets that have just died. Carpentry and stonemasonry are, they're very hard to find good people. We want to do the right thing. We need to get those skill sets back. They're highly relevant, more so today than ever, in terms of refurbishing these important buildings. And the report we did, which we presented in at the Houses of Parliament, shows we need double the amount of people in those professions that we have. There's about 100,000 now. We need 200,000 every year to 2050 if we're going to meet net zero. So we're never going to get there unless we get these basics right and get the right people in the right jobs, all skilled up and proud of that craftsmanship. I think it's a return to that.
That's a great point. And and creating that pride in your work. I think, Jonny, maybe do you want to build on that a little bit?
I agree more with that. I mean, the facts speak for themselves. There's a huge skills shortage, and this is an industry, broadly, built environment industry, that's struggling significantly reputationally. Grenfell is a terrible thing, but I think it's symptomatic of an industry that's got challenges around quality and standards. It's very difficult to escape that conclusion. It's an uncomfortable truth. We've got really major issues around diversity and inclusion. Still a very male, we love our male colleagues, but it's still a very male-dominated industry. And in my personal opinion, I don't think the industry does a very good job at all of informing people and making people aware of just how damn cool it is, what we're doing, especially when it comes to this, in my view, revolution that is upon us. It's going to shift the types of skills that are needed in the roles, and there's a lot of people who work in the industry. There's a lot of pride. You can hear it in what Simon's saying. There's a lot of pride in the physical environment, making places better for people. But we've just got to do a better job at managing that gap.
I might just pick up on the innovation point, and I think as a customer and user, we spend a lot of time actually going all the way up into the supply chain, our supplier's supplier. And if you think of those 4,500 products that are in the building example I gave you, we need to understand how paint's made. We need to understand, obviously, the holy trinity, concrete, glass, and steel, but we also need to understand literally, the vast majority of those things. So we'll spend time with the venture capital community or those foundations that are funding innovation, or in research labs going and looking how the solar panel technology is evolving, and then pulling that through as the end customer and insisting that those innovations get used in our buildings. So, for example, we're using in one of our buildings floor tiles that are actually not fired in a kiln, but they're made using nature mimicry. So they sprinkle bacteria on them, and they're cured at room temperature. Or for your leaky buildings, we've used a kind of like a fog system that you spray it into a room, you pressurize the room, and it finds every nook and cranny. Or for windows, we're using vacuum glass that has a special technology that makes it faster and cheaper to replace traditional window panes. And we're doing that, and we're introducing those innovations, actually pulling them through the supply chain and introducing them to our contractor parties and our engineering teams. But it does take a special skill, and to the jobs point, those skills oftentimes sit at the contractor or at the consulting or engineering level. They don't necessarily, the absence of skills doesn't necessarily sit at the kind of producer level. So there's, $1.8 trillion is invested every year into climate tech, and a lot of that is actually stuck at what I think of as the top of the funnel. And what's not happening, it's not being pulled through the bottom of the funnel on a demand side basis through people like us who are insisting changes to this traditional ways of operating and actually specifying these innovations in our buildings and trying to break this decades-long way of deeply entrenched ways of working.
That's really interesting. And I just want to maybe follow up on that, because I think with the, we don't really like change, and like what to try and convince people to kind of change the place where they live or they work. Like we've seen the debate on heat pumps in the UK, etc. Like how are you actually kind of building that sort of environment where people are receptive to that type of change?
Yeah, it's not easy, but I think you've got to have a practitioner's mindset. And I think part of the problem we face is that actually of the 28 million buildings that in the UK, 2 million of which are commercial, about £1 trillion worth of real estate, 60% of that is held in large institutional hands. And there are very few enlightened long-term holders like the Crown Estates. If you think of the large asset managers, and I won't name any because they might be sitting in the room, but you know who I mean, then they usually start with a color and then a stone. But you know, if you're sitting on managing 100 billion worth of real estate, you honestly could care less where your bricks come from. And you probably don't even know, and you probably will never know. All you care about is growing your asset base. But if you come at it with the passion that we all do, and I think then you can inspire teams on the ground and get them to try something different. Look, I think it's a risky business we're in. We don't want buildings to fail. It has catastrophic consequences. We want them to be successful. We want them to stand, and we want them to not hurt anyone. But beyond that, we actually need to think proactively about what positive impact they can have. How do we inspire people to be their best selves, to be engaged, to be enriched, to be inspired by the places that they're working in? And I think that ultimately has to be the driving force to innovation.
Can I just pick up on that briefly? So I totally agree, and we're sort of doing a bit of a carrot and stick on that. So the stick being we're putting green clauses in all our leases to ensure that we drive that through. And initially that was, we've kind of almost laughed out of the door. Today it's very much more standard. We're known for it. And then the sort of the carrot bit is really bringing people on the journey. So we've had a focus in our corporate KPIs to reduce energy consumption, and that's been really tough because we don't manage the bulk of the spaces. The tenants manage that, and they still want, not far less so now, but people wanted to leave their lights on all night or have access to an air-conditioned building 24/7. And just educating people that really you don't need that. And people have come on the journey, and we've seen some of the big players that you would, to your point, they wouldn't normally give a damn, thinking actually, no, our CSR, we do need to consider this. We can turn the lights off. We don't need it fully air conditioned all weekend. So I think it's step by step, but the carrot and stick, I think, certainly helps from our perspective.
Jonny?
Yeah, I mean, I so sincerely believe it starts with belief. You know, just to give you a sort of sense of scale, so we employ 4,000 people directly and about 30,000 people on any given day on our sites through our subcontract supply chain, which we share with all our peer group. So this tells you straight away that if we're going to move the dial in any meaningful way, we have to collaborate with our peer group. We cannot keep thinking that the problem lies within our four walls to solve. So although we're doing everything we can to set the right targets and comply, we've really got to think radically differently about how we work with our peer group colleagues. Talking about within the four walls, you know, we are really investing because we believe actually there's jeopardy, there's also responsibility, but there's also the excitement of there is undoubtedly commercial opportunity in low carbon. There's no question, and we're in markets already where we're experimenting with that. And this is the turbulence I'm talking about, experimenting at speed. But we've got 50 colleagues now in sustainability and social value. We've designed internally an environmental management leadership course. I think we've had 70 people through that now. And the feeling in the business when you engage with those people that have been through that, they basically get captured personally. That their understanding of what's going on is much clearer. Their sense of agency is increased. And you're seeing a real desire around the business to make a difference. This is born out of, we're actually putting funds and money, sort of money where our mouth is. We think the organisation needs to transform to play our part in an industry that equally needs to transform.
That's really encouraging because obviously we need to bring the people on board and to get them involved. But I guess one point maybe I want to come back to is, Simon, you mentioned the skills shortage, and I think you said that report, it needed to double. And I guess, and it's also been mentioned about the lack of diversity maybe in this industry. And, you know, if we're trying to draw from a small pool, conscious I'm speaking to three men to answer this question, but hopefully one of you will be brave enough to go first and just talk about how do we, as an industry, from the kind of white collar perspective and the blue collar perspective, become more diverse and inclusive, and what are your organizations doing to support that? I don't know who's brave enough.
I'll dive in. I don't mind. Look, I think diversity is obviously is a lightning rod for a lot of different opinions. But what I would say is that what we need is a diversity of mindset most of all, and if that comes from being part of different socioeconomic or cultural or geographic locations, so be it. But what we need is a diversity of mindset, which we don't currently have. And we need people who are thinking about innovation as much as they are about risk mitigation. And again, that's what most organizations don't have. So we employ people that have engineering backgrounds, architect, design, art, English. Doesn't matter. I think you need to really have a rich experience in the office. But there is again a fundamental problem with the structure of the industry. And Lord Turner talked about the 2 million people who are employed in the construction industry. And that's made up of 375,000 organizations, companies that are registered for VAT and construction. So just quick mental math, that's 5.5 people per organization. Half of those 375,000 firms have one employee. There are 140 firms that have more than 500. It's incredible. It's atomized. And so when you talk about upskilling and jobs and hiring, you're literally talking to a man or a woman in a van working by themselves, who's trying to make ends meet, who's trying to, juggle everything that we all juggle in our lives times 10, and you're telling them that you now need to change from being a gas engineer to being a heat pump engineer. They're like, I just really want to get through to Friday. So I think the challenge is enormous, and I applaud the larger firm like Wates, employing thousands of people and are doing this at scale. But we also need to operate at scale, at the same time operating at the absolute most micro level of micro levels. And I think that is a genuine challenge.
I'm really glad you picked up on that point, because it was one of the questions I wanted to follow up on, and I'd be interested to get your perspectives, Jonny and Simon, on that point.
Just on our side, we've got a development pipeline over the next 10 years of about £2.5 billion, which is reinvesting, refurbishing, getting the estate up fit for purpose. A lot of what we want to do in terms of boosting and supporting skills and diversity is working really closely with our contractor partners in that. But equally well, we want to step up. What we do have is space. So we're currently looking at, for example, setting up a permanent skills hub in the heart of the West End, where people can come from far and away or locally and be trained up and come out with something that's actually meaningful. So if we can step up into those places, others can also follow suit. Again, we can partner with others. We're partnering with Westminster City Council on this. So there are various initiatives, again, we can follow through. But we're doing a lot of work with our contractor partners,
Yeah, so the scale of the challenge is gargantuan. So if I referred earlier to public housing. There's roughly 6 million homes that we've got to make more energy efficient. And we need clear, consistent policy, which we don't have. And we need sufficient funding, which we don't have either, in order to get to that 2050 target of all homes being net zero carbon. So we started, there's something called the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. That's about 3 billion. There's something else called ECO, it's another billion. But that is probably about 4 or 5% of the funding required to get us to that point. So that in itself is some sense of context about what's going on. We're probably the number 2 deliverer of low carbon retrofit in public housing. We've done 9,000 homes. We can see a pipeline in front of us of more, but the funding runs until 2028. So how do we as an organization, with risk capital, organize, orientate ourselves, take risk to scale up and mobilize? It needs to be more of a war footing. It genuinely does. We need a massive increase in the number of people. So we are developing and honing a methodology about how, if you take 600 homes in Greenwich, and we're working with Greenwich at the moment, putting together a team of people, getting those people trained. Actually, they need new accreditations and qualifications that don't exist either. So it's coming, but it's all coming slowly in a very piecemeal way. So I guess my single point is there's some good experimentation going on, but it's at nowhere near the rate that we need if we're genuinely serious about a 2050 target.
Yeah, and that just makes me think of your earlier point, Basil, about how we still need to change so much, and how do we do that, and how do we accelerate that scale. And I guess, you know, the numbers that you're talking about are quite staggering, and I've talked about the renovation challenge across Europe as part of my role for a very long time, and it's just so challenging to do because of all of the different issues, and you're dealing with people, and how do you do that. But I guess if we are going to have, as you said, like a war footing, there's a new government, relatively new now, I guess 3 months, in place. What would you be asking them as organisations who are leading in this space to do to facilitate that journey? And who will I ask first? Basil, you're smiling. So,
I mean, yeah, I think there's some very tactical things that that we can do. In some ways, the incentives are actually in the exact opposite way. If you just take the VAT system, for example, you pay 20% VAT on a refurbishment. You pay 5%, generally speaking, on new construction. It's completely perverse. Level it. Either make them all 20 or all 5. I don't really care which way it goes. But why am I being penalized as someone who's committed to doing 100% retrofits? Then my end product ends up being more expensive than someone who's committed to knocking things down and rebuilding them. I think the second thing I would say is that we've been a huge advocate of carbon tax and carbon pricing. Again, you know, we're building only net zero carbon buildings. We're blowing through the recommendations in terms of embodied carbon. Level the playing field for me. Make it so that actually I can then, people who are not as committed to embodied carbon as we are taxed. And Westminster now has done that, 880 pounds a ton for carbon, which I think is to be applauded. And that money should go 100% directly into jobs and skills training to deliver those kind of low carbon retrofits that and those jobs that we so desperately need. Those are two very easy, you know, with the stroke of a pen, legislative wins that I would implore the government to do.
I mean, the setting up of Skills England, I think, is hopeful. So let's see how that pans out. They're clearly a government that wants to be bold and make some big initial first steps. So let's watch that and see if we can support them.
Might sound arcane, but there's something called Part Z, which anyone who's in building probably knows about, but it's fundamentally about embodied carbon and the whole life cycle of carbon in buildings. And the previous government was reluctant to push on with Part Z, but I really think they should do. In France, they have done, and it raises the bar tremendously in terms of how all the actors, and it is a complex supply chain, but all the actors in the system think about carbon and buildings from the get-go, and then think about the whole life cycle of that. So I'd be really keen. It isn't all about government, though. I do think we have a big opportunity to excite people about the upsides of this, because the byproduct of low carbon refurbishment in public housing isn't just about energy efficiency. It's also about energy security. It's also about decency and warm homes. It's actually about health as well. It's also about job creation. So there are a whole litany of good things, byproducts that arise out of this kind of activity. And I think we could just do a bit of a better job at getting on the front foot when we're talking about these things.
yeah, that's a really important point about the multiple benefits of actually tackling these issues, because when you're speaking to politicians or leaders, they may not be interested in the energy savings or the climate, but they care about things like, you know, comfort, well-being, energy security, and that's, you know, quite a challenge. I think I just want to go back to the embodied carbon point, because we talk about operational energy an awful lot, and, you know, we really obviously need to drive that down. But, you know, speaking about the amount of growth that we're going to see in Africa and other regions, that means we really need to start tackling the embodied carbon component. And as you mentioned, the regulation in France, the updated Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which will apply to all of Europe, is going to require whole life carbon reporting. So, and that's going to drive innovation down the supply chain, and that's going to have impacts then, I guess, on like what kind of you know, workers you need, what type of skills you need, what it means for the green economy, and also like the circular economy aspect. And I'd just be interested to get your perspectives on what kind of shift we need to see to embrace regulation as bold as that is requiring us to not only look at the operational but the embodied.
I think it's a wholesale change in systems, really at a industry by industry basis. If you take circularity, for example, we've done a lot of work around circularity. We actually took at one of our buildings steel out of House of Fraser on Oxford Street, and then redeployed it in a retrofit that we were doing, and not a token beam or two, but wholly 10% of our steel need we took from House of Fraser. And if you think of that, that was 1930s steel, pre-modern steel making. There was no protocol for doing it. It's a different way of making steel, which I won't bore you with, but it's like a microwave oven versus, you know, a barbecue grill. You know, it's chalk and cheese. So we figured out how to do it. We wrote the code for the industry on how to use pre-war steel and reuse it in a modern building. That's great, and that hopefully will encourage others to do it. But actually, what we need is we need a marketplace for circularity, and there are some that are emerging. And then you think about, you know, a proper way to integrate that into procurement processes, and there are now engineering firms that literally can, click to buy into their CAD models steel, for example, out of inventory that's being held at stockists of secondhand steel. And then you can think about a futures market. You know I'm going to renovate a building in 3 years. You might be taking one apart in 3 years. How do we get connected so that I can take your doors and windows and steel out of your building in 3 years' time to put it into mine? And there are people who are doing that. And these are all real-world examples that exist today, and I think we just need to nurture them and foster them and encourage them to grow.
I love hearing examples like that. Maybe it's just the built environment nerd in me, but just to be able to talk about, you know, how you can be really cleverly use the system we all live in to actually build a better system. I really just want that to be kind of more widely known. But maybe I'll get Jonny to come in on that point.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll throw in another couple of examples since you like them. Exciting. I've found them. Yes, I mean, there's one of our rivals or competitors, Bouygues. They've got a target for timber of 30% of timber in their buildings by 2030. That is seriously cool and actually very difficult to do, I would say. But it's specific and it's public, and they're having a good go. And then you've got Cemex. They've got a cement product called Vertura, and that's 70% lower carbon than conventional cement. Saint-Gobain have got a glass product called Ore, and that is 30%, I think, less carbon than a conventional glass product. So, you know, I mean, whether the legislation's here now or later, it's coming. And I've done some work with one or two of those companies directly in a different capacity, and they feel the jeopardy also. We're not going to be allowed not to do it. The built environment maybe has been slower than some other industries to adapt, maybe like energy or automotive, but it's coming. And so, you know, it's either managed in a measured way, it's a bit late for that probably, or it's going to be deeply uncomfortable. So there is a lot of investment going in, and we do need that sort of the whole community, including the investment community. And the Conduit does some really great work actually around that kind of thing, identifying. We've got something called the WIN portal, and it's an exercise whereby we seek not just low carbon solutions, but building efficient solutions, small companies, and we then match them with our client base. So we've got a Green Dragon's Den, for example, with Lloyds Banking Group, and we do it annually. 200 applicants, and 10 of them will get funding and support and the opportunity to roll out through the Lloyds Banking Group estate, which is very significant. But that kind of thing is such a small example, but it's indicative of something. What we need to do is to make it, this stuff needs to become not like one example, but mainstream if we can.
And I think that point about the inevitability is definitely coming. Like, we call it the inevitable policy response, because something is going to have to change to drive us to get to where we need to go to. So we've got 9 minutes left, and I've been told to create some time for audience questions. So does anyone want to ask anything to any of her? We've got one hand up. I think someone's come on with a mic.
Thanks a lot. It's been a really refreshing discussion, particularly, you know, regardless of lack of diversity, actually embracing that diversity of thought, and you know, and you guys all putting it at the centre. My question is to do with, and you alluded to it, Basil, I think, in terms of, you know, calling out whether they be elephants in the room or uncomfortable truths or coloured stones in the room, but the dynamic that often is talked about within built environment is capital appreciation and inequality and things like that. How can that be addressed? Because surely that is one of the biggest blockers that exists around how, there's not that distribution of wealth and opportunities and everything else. How can that be? What are some of the thoughts on how that can be addressed? That dynamic that exists. Is that clear?
Yeah, look, I think we don't separate the E from the S. I mean, they're not, uncomfortable bedfellows. They are deeply integrated, and you don't do one on a Tuesday and the other one on a Thursday. And so we think that actually that creates better buildings that tenants and the community want to use, that ultimately drives rents and drives profitability. And again, I think we shouldn't be afraid to talk about profit, because if it's not sustainable, small s, it's not sustainable, big S. So, for example, in our commercial buildings, we created something called an urban village hall. We put it in all our buildings, usually about 3 to 5% of the net floor area. We give it back to the community. We curate it together with them, with social enterprises, have convenings that might look a little bit like this. It might be an after-school reading program. It might be jobs and skills. And then we bring the occupiers along on that journey to make sure that we're aligning with their own social purposes, and indeed that their staff come down and participate and read to the kids after school or teach them about IT or whatever it might be. And you create this kind of social cohesion, which is maybe kind of the fundamental point which you're getting at, and you really you create a building that might look shiny and new and have £100 square foot rents, but it actually is as much for the community, genuinely as much for the community as for anything. And I think lastly, we're small, and we don't have an estate like that or like King's Cross or whatnot, but we can prove that we can do that on a 50,000 square foot building, which is really, it's the every building on every street case. So if we can do it, anyone can.
Anyone want to follow up, or any other questions?
Hi, yeah, I have a question on the education and training bit, and I wrote it down just so I didn't lose my train of thought. So a lot of technology and a lot of industries made education, upskilling, and training cheaper and more accessible, but in a built environment setting, it's more difficult because Zoom lectures, a series of YouTube videos, or online modules doesn't work as well when you have, the hands-on requirements of apprenticeships or, trades that you need. So how do you leverage that technology to make education and training cheaper, faster, and more accessible for those skills that we need, while also embedding the real hands-on time and skills needed?
Yeah, I can have a crack at that. This is when the rubber really hits the road, and it's got to be done anyway. But at the moment, we are literally designing from scratch, but with appropriate partners, new training programs to upskill a workforce that can deliver this low carbon retrofit in public housing. So it couldn't be more practical. So new accreditations, new training partners, new methods for delivering that. What we'd rather be doing is doing that, putting that effort and investment into bigger numbers so we can get some economies of scale, because it is quite costly. There's something called the Supply Chain Sustainability School in the industry, which is kind of interesting actually, because going back to my point about collaboration, it's a good example of cross-industry collaboration where different organizations with the industry are co-funding this kind of training and development in order to get the rate of learning that we need. And one final point, this sort of idea about green skills and green jobs, it isn't just about new jobs. It's about the way in which, in our industry, existing jobs are adapting, some of which are adapting at quite high speed. So if you think about someone who's going to put loft insulation in a house or might install solar panels on a roof, there are new skills that they might need to learn in order to do that. But actually, these are the same people that were doing 10 or 15 years ago. There was a program called Decent Homes in the UK public sector housing, a huge program. And these people were replacing front doors, replacing windows, they were replacing kitchens, they were replacing bathrooms. So this sort of rollout, the mass mobilization, is something that we've done before, and we can do it again. It would just help a lot if it was at greater scale.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and we have one hand up. So.
Hi, Richard Tyree from Good People. Thanks to all the panel. The construction industry lost about 22% of its headcount between 2019 to today. it faces a demographic time bomb with 40% of the workforce about to retire. 18% of the workforce was lost post-Brexit. We have more people exiting the sector every year than enter the sector every year. Only 40% of the apprenticeships that start in construction complete. So I think we can see some chronic and acute sort of system level failures as far as the sector's approach to talent and skills. What role do you think developers and landowners need to play in catalysing new ways of approaching this? Number one, do you think you're doing enough? Number two, to Jonny's point about the majority of your delivery is via complex supply chains rather than in-house, what sort of role do you think developers and landowners need to play in encouraging their own supply chains to take a longer term view and to reduce your own delivery risk around the lack of talent and skills available?
Hard question to end on, but sorry.
Yeah, I can start on that one. I mean, I think as a landowner and long-term sort of asset manager, it's fundamental to the success of our business, bluntly, and the success of London and everything else. So it comes back to the partnership point. You know, historically, on a planning consent, you tick a box to do X amount of apprenticeships, and that would be as involved as you got, and then it was over to Wates or Boyga, whoever, to deliver on it. That doesn't work now. It's got to be a lot more than that, and we fully support that. So engaging with the partners to help deliver and to help step forward, as I said, with skills hubs that we can actually provide space for, and making sure it's more than a box tick, that we've all got to play that part, definitely.
Yeah, and I think it's an awareness of these acute issues, and I think it's a competitive advantage if you're able to address them. I think it creates better buildings, creates better storytelling around them, and it's self-healing. Again, we're relatively small developer, but you know, in our contracts with our contractors, we insist on going well above and beyond what's in the planning requirement. So at our building at Tower Bridge, for example, I know the numbers. We've sent about 100 people through the apprenticeship program, and we've done much better than those statistics that you've raised in terms of retention. Why? Because people from my team, or indeed myself, will go down and give tours and tell about our passion and our vision. We invited all 100 of them to the topping out ceremony, so we had, you know, probably twice as many young people that we're trying to inspire into construction as we had agents and brokers and others on the roof of the building when we topped it out. And I think these kind of small details around, frankly, just caring more and doing it in a genuine and authentic way, it has so many different knock-on effects. It directly addresses the problems that you mentioned, but it also creates a better product at the end of the day that we can rent for more money and ultimately sell faster.
Is there time?
Yes, please.
Well, no, I thought it was a great question. I mean, it was right on point, and you know, a very tough one, and backed up with some good and hard to hear stats around that. So there were multiple questions, layers within it, but fundamentally the answer is no. Clearly we're not rising to the challenge, and that's the collective. So it's all of us. The thing that I care about probably most around the idea of inclusion is that a lot of people just look at the industry and think it's not a place for me. That is catastrophically wasteful. It's also not fair. So we need to get that sorted out, and there's some really deep work involved in doing that, to do with culture, that probably doesn't happen overly quickly. You know, it's probably not a coincidence that there are 3 males of a certain age sitting here in front of you. The good news is the next generation of my family, they're mostly female. And the quicker they get on the field of play, the better. And you know, we do talk about this very regularly, and we're really encouraging it without wanting to overface them. But you know, step by step, every single corner, you have to have a really front foot attitude. So we need to change the culture. The government can help with being strategic around skills in the industry. It would help if we didn't have a new construction minister every 12 months. So some continuity and some commitment at a strategic level to the industry. This is 2 million people we're talking about. It's 8% of GDP. It should matter more than that. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of passion, but I think in the end we have to get forensic in our approach to it. So probably not time now, but I could share with you some of the things that the industry is doing, or we're doing in-house at Wates as well, around encouraging a more diverse workforce. And just to give you a bit of feedback, when we put our minds to stuff, we're good at delivery. We really are. And this one area around the data and the improvement that we hope to see is proving extremely difficult. It really is. So we've got to loop back round and we've got to double down, but we've got to do it. Got to do it.
I think that's a good note to wrap up on. If we can, put our mind to stuff, we can do it. And I think, I've been working in this industry for a long time, and I do think that's true. It's about bringing all of the pieces together and making it happen. And I do think when I hear stories like this and the storytelling, which I think is really important, we can, move forward. So sorry to wrap up so quickly, but there's a screen flashing at me. But hopefully, if people are able to stay, there's going to be some time for questions to our panel. And thank you so much for sharing your insights and taking the time. It's really fascinating.